The wind off the Atlantic was sharp that day, sharp enough to cut through silk, through silence, through vows unspoken. She arrived as a baroness in name only, stepping through the gates of Halverton Manor like a woman entering her own burial. A marriage of convenience, a house cloaked in mourning, a husband who would not meet her eyes. But behind locked doors, something waited, something unfinished, burning quietly beneath the ash. What secret sleeps in the West Wing? And what happens when duty brings two broken souls face to face with a fire they can no longer ignore? Tell us, where in the world are you listening from? And what is it about period romances that still captures your heart? Newport, Rhode Island, autumn of 1890. The Atlantic wind blew sharp and salt-heavy as the carriage rattled down the gravel path leading to Halverton Manor. Beneath a sky streaked in pewter and rose, Lucille Foster sat straight-backed, gloved hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed beyond the glass window, though she saw nothing but the ghost of her own reflection. She was 42 and had long since learned the art of composure. Her features, though softened by time, held the elegance of a woman carved not by indulgence, but by restraint. Her porcelain skin bore the faintest trace of youthful freckles, and her hair, deep chestnut touched now by silver, was arranged in a braided chignon beneath a feathered traveling hat. Her gown was a muted dove grey, high-collared, fastened with a single onyx brooch at the throat. No one watching her arrive would have known she carried within her a quiet tremor. The gates of Halverton Manor opened with slow groans. She passed through them as one might enter a tomb, deliberately with reverence, and no expectation of return. The estate loomed ahead, its stone facade a masterpiece of solemn grandeur. Ivy clung to the walls like the fingers of time, and the tall windows stared out, blind and unspeaking. Smoke curled from one chimney only. The others remained cold, sealed. Lucille stepped down from the carriage as a footman in dark livery approached. Behind him stood a woman of stern posture and grey hair pinned tightly beneath a cap, Mrs. Ambrose, the housekeeper, whose letters had been brisk and correct. "Baroness Halverton," Mrs. Ambrose said, offering a curt bow. "Welcome to the manor." Lucille's breath caught slightly at the sound of her new title. It had been spoken before, on paper, in whispers, but never aloud. Not until now. "Thank you," she replied, her voice composed, though her heart fluttered like silk in a storm. Inside, the manor was a study in stillness. The walls were lined with oil portraits in gilded frames, none more recent than a decade past. The scent of polished wood and faded roses lingered, as if the house refused to forget. No servants bustled about. No warmth greeted her, only silence. Edward Halverton awaited her in the drawing room. He stood tall, nearly a head above her, dressed in a deep charcoal coat with a high collar and a dark cravat knotted at his throat. His hair, dark with hints of grey, was combed neatly back, and his beard was trimmed close, revealing sharp, melancholic features. He looked not at her, but past her, as though speaking to someone who had not yet arrived. "Mrs. Foster," he began. "Lucille." Her heart thudded once at the sound of her name from his lips. Low, dry, but not unkind. "My lord," she answered with a slight incline of her head. He motioned toward a chair but did not sit. She obeyed, her posture regal, her back straight despite the long journey. "You will find the household well kept," he said, voice as distant as winter rain. "You may go where you please, except the West Wing. That portion is closed. I ask that it remains so." She nodded once. "As you wish. I do not expect affection, Lucille, nor inquiry, only discretion and peace." "I ask for the same," she replied, gently. Their eyes met then, green shadowed with sorrow, blue-grey layered with silence. Something passed between them in that gaze, not warmth but recognition. Two souls who had once burned and now bore only the scent of ash. That evening she was shown to her rooms, a chamber of faded blue damask, a marble hearth untouched by flame, and a writing desk beside a narrow window overlooking the cliffs. She unpacked with care, placing each item with ritual precision. Her mother's comb, her late husband's watch, a book of psalms worn at the edges. She did not cry. She had already done so in private in Boston, in the stillness of rooms no one visited. Here, she would not allow herself such indulgence. Not yet. As night fell, a chill settled into the bones of the house. Somewhere down the corridor, a grandfather clock tolled 10. Lucille stood before the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Far beyond, the sea roared against the rocks like a beast kept at bay. Behind her, the manor sighed. In the west wing, a single light flickered, and then was gone. Morning came draped in a veil of fog. The sea was barely visible beyond the cliffs, and the garden paths glistened with dew, untouched by human footstep. Within Halverton Manor, the silence remained sovereign. It was a house that did not wake, it endured. Lucille Foster Halverton rose from her bed with measured grace, as was her habit, and dressed with the assistance of no one. The gowns had arrived from Boston weeks before her, and she chose one now of plum-colored wool, with a delicate cream collar and satin-covered buttons that fastened from throat to waist. Her hands moved with precision, but her gaze drifted often to the tall windows, where shadows of mist played tricks upon the light. She was a baroness now, in name, in appearance, in protocol, but not yet in spirit. At breakfast, a single place was set in the morning room. A porcelain cup waited beside a dish of preserved plums and a slice of bread that steamed gently beside silverware polished to a military shine. No footsteps echoed in the corridor, no greeting, no rustle of morning paper or turning pages. Edward did not appear. Instead, Mrs. Ambrose entered in silence, straight-backed and efficient as always. She adjusted a curtain, refolded a napkin, and then paused by the sideboard as though weighing a question. "My lord takes his morning repast in the study," she said at last, not looking directly at Lucille. "He prefers solitude." "I have observed that," Lucille answered evenly. "And does he prefer it always?" Mrs. Ambrose turned, hands folded before her waist. "Often, but not always." That was all. Later that morning, Lucille made her way to the south gallery. The corridors of the manor were wide and dimly lit. The wallpaper faded in places, the moulding elaborate and crowned with dust. Yet there was something beautiful in its wear, as if the house had not aged poorly, but with character, like old linen folded over time. The gallery was long, and its windows looked out upon the barren garden, now tangled and brown with the last sighs of autumn. Along the opposite wall hung a series of oil portraits in elaborate frames. Ancestors, she presumed. Lords and ladies with pale skin and powdered hair, some in military uniform, others in lace-collared gowns, all wearing expressions of solemn importance. But at the end of the hall, above a marble-topped console table, hung a portrait unlike the rest. It was not grand in size nor elaborate in execution, but it captured the eye. A woman sat in a high-backed chair by a window. Her gown was pale blue, trimmed with ivory lace, her auburn hair cascading in gentle waves over her shoulders. One hand rested delicately upon her lap, the other held a closed book, leather-bound with gold filigree. Her face was turned slightly away from the viewer, but her eyes, almond-shaped and amber in tone, seemed to follow Lucille as she approached. There was something breathless in her beauty, not merely because it was delicate, but because it seemed on the verge of vanishing. A brass plaque beneath the frame bore one word, Eleanor. Lucille felt a shiver trace her spine. She stepped closer. The brushwork was fine, the style more intimate than formal. It had not been painted for posterity, it had been painted for love. Later that afternoon, the first of the guests arrived. Though the marriage had been quiet, the whispers of it had not remained so. Newport society, always hungry for novelty, was eager to see the mysterious widow from Boston who had wed the English baron like a scene plucked from a serialized novel. Lucille greeted them with perfect poise, wearing a sapphire gown and a string of pearls once belonging to her mother. She moved through the drawing room like mist through a grove, never too present, never invisible. She listened more than she spoke. She smiled rarely, but when she did, it left an impression, but their glances did not soften. Their curiosity was sharpened by subtle cruelty. "The manor is quaint," one woman whispered to another, her fan fluttering like a hummingbird. "I heard the Baron no longer receives guests," another murmured. "A touch of melancholia, perhaps." "I heard it was madness," someone replied. "His first wife was never quite sound." Lucille turned, the echo of those words loud despite the hush in which they were spoken. But she showed nothing. Her face remained serene. Her voice, when summoned, was gracious. Edward did not attend the gathering, not even for a moment. That night, long after the guests had gone and the lamps had been extinguished, Lucille found herself restless. The manor felt heavier than usual. She wandered the corridor barefoot, wrapped in a soft wool shawl, and descended to the library, hoping the scent of books and the hush of paper might calm her thoughts. It was there, beneath a window draped in velvet, that she found the camellia. It was dry, the petals flattened and brown, pressed between the pages of a leather-bound volume of poetry. She had reached for it absent-mindedly, drawn by the title, Whispers in Twilight. But the moment she opened the book, the brittle flower fell into her hand like a relic, and there, scrawled in delicate ink upon the inside cover, was a name. Eleanor Halverton Lucille stood still. The fire in the hearth crackled softly. She stared at the handwriting, so refined, so feminine, and felt something stir within her. The woman in the portrait, the woman in the letters she would one day find, the woman whose presence lingered not in body, but in memory, in whispers, in the very air she breathed. Lucille closed the book gently and held the camellia in her palm. It crumbled slightly, the petals turning to dust upon her skin. She did not weep, but her throat tightened. Upstairs, the wind moaned softly through the corridor. Somewhere beyond, in the west wing she had been forbidden to enter, a door creaked. She turned toward the sound, her heart fluttering like a caged bird. But the silence returned, and she stood alone once more. The night air was thick with the salt of the sea, and the fog that had blanketed the manor all day now clung to its stone walls like a sorrow that refused to lift. Halverton Manor, vast and veiled in shadows, slept beneath a waning moon, its windows closed tightly against the chill. Inside, the silence was near complete, broken only by the distant, steady tick of the grandfather clock that dwelled in the main corridor like an old sentry keeping count of ghosts. Lucille lay in bed, her eyes open in the dark. Sleep had not come easily since her arrival. The bed was soft, the linens fine, the chamber well appointed, yet her soul refused to rest. The house itself felt watchful, as though it knew she did not belong. She turned toward the fire, its embers barely glowing, and closed her eyes once more, seeking refuge. And then, softly, almost imperceptibly, it came. Music. The faintest notes of a piano, like a whisper echoing through a dream. Lucille sat up slowly, the sheet falling from her shoulders. For a moment, she thought it her imagination, one of those half-sounds that the mind invents in the hush of night. But no, the melody grew clearer, a slow and mournful strain. A single hand on the keys, hesitant, searching. She rose and slipped into her dressing gown, its pale silk catching the faint light of the fire. Her bare feet made no sound on the carpet as she moved to the door and opened it cautiously. The corridor was empty, its shadows long and silent. The music came from the west. From the wing she had been forbidden to enter. She hesitated, heart thudding, then stepped into the hall. The music called to her, not loudly, but insistently. It was not joyful. It carried something aching, something old. She passed the row of portraits, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. The melody continued, a waltz perhaps, though slowed nearly to stillness. When she reached the final door, where the corridor curved toward the locked wing, the music stopped. Lucille stood before the threshold in silence. She raised her hand and knocked. Once. The sound was swallowed by the wood. No voice answered. No movement stirred. She waited, breath suspended, but the silence deepened like a velvet curtain falling between acts. After a long moment, she turned away and returned to her room, the music still lingering somewhere beneath her ribs, like a memory not yet remembered. The next morning, light poured through the tall windows of the breakfast room, casting long golden bars across the black and white tiles. Lucille sat at the table alone, her tea untouched, her thoughts adrift in the haze of the night's sound. Mrs. Ambrose entered precisely at 8:30, as she did each morning, to oversee the clearing of the tray and the arrangement of the flowers that stood in a crystal vase. Lucille watched her a moment, then spoke softly. "Does someone play the piano in this house, Mrs. Ambrose?" The housekeeper paused, but did not turn. "There are several pianos, madam, one in the drawing room, one in the music salon." "I mean the one in the west wing." Silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Ambrose straightened a spoon. Then she turned, her face unreadable. "Some wings were shut for good reason, madam," she said quietly. "Best not to open what time has chosen to close." Lucille met her eyes. "And yet the music plays." Mrs. Ambrose bowed her head slightly, "Only for those who still listen." The conversation ended there. No further explanation was given. None was needed. That afternoon, a visitor arrived from Boston. The name on the card was Mrs. Hortense Carr, an old acquaintance from Beacon Hill, widow of a shipping magnate and a woman whose gloved hand had shaped many a social season with a mere twitch of her fan. Lucille had not expected to see her again. But Mrs. Carr entered with the air of one bestowing grace upon the less fortunate. She wore a gown of forest green silk, trimmed in black lace, and her hat bore a cluster of peacock feathers that trembled with each step. Her eyes, sharp and curious, scanned the drawing room as if appraising its worth. "My dear Lucille," she exclaimed, embracing her with exaggerated warmth. "How rustic." Lucille smiled gently. "It is not Boston, no." "No, indeed," Mrs. Carr replied, her eyes flitting toward the old tapestries on the wall. "But then neither are you. I was quite shocked, you know, to read of it in the Courier, married, and to an Englishman no one had seen in society in years. I thought perhaps it was a mistake." "It was not," Lucille said simply. Mrs. Carr lowered her voice and leaned in, as though confiding a great truth. "You were the jewel of Beacon Hill, Lucille, and now here you are, like one of those heroines in a novel, exiled in a manor by the sea, haunting your own life." Lucille's jaw tensed, but her smile remained. "I would rather haunt something real," she said quietly, "than host another empty parlor filled with false smiles." Mrs. Carr drew back, lips pursed. "Of course," she said. "One must always find dignity, even in solitude." After tea, the woman left, her perfume lingering like a stain. Lucille remained seated long after the butler cleared the silver tray. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers interlaced, still and composed. But inside, the words had struck like stones against glass. Exile. Solitude. She had worn those words before, had wrapped them around herself like armor in Boston after her first husband's death had left her not only widowed but invisible. Yet hearing them again, spoken in that clipped, cruel tone, awakened something sharper beneath her skin. She rose and returned to the gallery. The portrait of Eleanor watched her still. Lucille stared back this time, unflinching. "Was it exile for you too?" she whispered. That evening, as the light faded and the house fell into its usual hush, Lucille sat alone in the music salon. The grand piano before her remained closed, its keys untouched for years. She did not know how to play, but she opened the lid anyway and placed her fingers gently on the cool ivory. She pressed one key, then another. The sound was brittle and imperfect, but it was something. Behind her, the fire crackled faintly, and somewhere, deep within the walls, a piano began to play once more. Slow, mournful, beckoning. Lucille did not turn. She closed her eyes and listened. The morning of the gathering broke with deceptive gentleness. The sea was calm, the air crisp, and Halverton Manor, so often shrouded in stillness, seemed to hum faintly with anticipation. In the great drawing room, footmen moved like shadows, dusting the antique furniture, adjusting draperies, and polishing silver until it gleamed like frost under candlelight. Lucille stood at the center of it all, directing preparations with a calm hand and a gaze sharp enough to detect the slightest imperfection. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, the velvet catching the light with every turn. A modest brooch glimmered at her throat, a gift from her mother, worn not for display, but for memory. Her hair was swept into an elegant braided crown, revealing the strong line of her neck, her only adornment the quiet dignity she carried like silk upon her skin. This was her first official appearance as Baroness Halverton. It was not affection she intended to inspire, it was command. By late afternoon, the guests began to arrive. Newport society, elegant, gloved and lacquered, stepped across the marble threshold with voices wrapped in politeness and eyes lined with scrutiny. They came in carriages drawn by white horses and brown, their feathers bobbing like faint ridicule in the wind. The women sparkled in silk and taffeta, the men bore crests on their rings and generational entitlement in their posture. Lucille greeted each one with poise. Her smile was faint, practiced, perfect. She clasped hands, exchanged greetings, and offered compliments wrapped in subtle armor. She knew what they whispered behind their fans, behind their cigars. She felt it in the tilt of a head, the lift of a brow, the hesitation before a name. She was the widow from Beacon Hill, wasn't she? Indeed. Wealthy, yes, but no title, until now. Bought it, I imagine. That's the way of things these days. She's beautiful still, poor thing. Though there's something distant about her. Hollow, perhaps. Lucille kept her chin lifted, her hands steady around her crystal glass. She moved through the room as if born to it, never lingering too long, never faltering. But each word, each veiled insult, left an invisible thread tightening at the base of her throat. She looked for Edward. He did not appear. At the piano, a young woman played a cheerful nocturne, her notes tripping over themselves like polite conversation. Lucille stood near the mantel, gazing absently at the flames as conversations circled her like perfume. Lady Clarissa Van Holt, with her velvet turban and practiced smile, approached with the air of a woman preparing to strike with silk. "My dear Baroness," she said, voice as sweet as syrup, "you must miss the bustle of Boston. Surely Newport must feel provincial to someone with your background." Lucille met her eyes with quiet steel. "On the contrary," she replied, "Boston is full of noise. Here, one hears truth more clearly." Clarissa tilted her head. "How poetic! But I do hope you won't bury yourself in this house. It would be a shame to waste such refinement." Lucille smiled gently. "We are none of us wasted, Lady Van Holt. Only misread." Clarissa's smile stiffened. Indeed. She moved on, defeated, but not destroyed. Later that evening, as the candles flickered low and the last of the carriages departed, Lucille remained alone in the drawing room. The fire had quieted to embers. Her gloves rested on the arm of a chair. She stood before the tall window, her reflection dimmed by the glass, watching the fog crawl in from the cliffs. She felt hollow, not from weariness, but from restraint. What life had she truly entered? What role had she accepted? Wife, baroness, hostess, shadow. She turned, slowly, and made her way down the hall. The west wing was not far. She stopped before the door that marked the threshold of that forbidden space. Her hand hovered over the brass knob, the memory of the music still vivid in her veins, but she did not open it. Instead, she turned back and descended to the study. Edward was there, standing before the hearth with a brandy in hand, still dressed in his evening attire, though his tie had been loosened and his expression had shed all formality. "I thought you might appear," he said without looking at her. She entered quietly. "You left the guests to me." "I had nothing to offer them," he replied. "Nor they to me." Lucille moved toward the fire, her voice low. "They speak of you, Edward, of your wife. They call her mad." He turned slowly, his green eyes dark beneath furrowed brows. "She was not mad," he said. "Only alone." Lucille's breath caught at the edges of that word. "I see," she murmured. "And am I to be different, or merely quieter?" He studied her. Something flickered across his features. Pain, perhaps. Regret. "She was made of fire," he said finally, voice rough. You are still." Lucille stepped closer, the air between them charged with something unspeakable. "Still," she repeated, "as in lifeless, as in controlled." he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. She burned until she vanished. I am ash, Lucille, and I will not ignite again. Her throat tightened, not with sadness, with fury, with longing, with a grief she could not name. I never asked to be a flame, she said softly, but I will not be stone. He looked away then, and without another word left the room. She did not follow. Alone by the fire, Lucille stood very still. The shadows around her lengthened as the candles died. She had not come to be a ghost. She had come to live. And now the house would have to learn what that meant. The storm arrived without warning. By midday, the skies above Newport had turned the color of lead, and winds lashed against the manor walls like a mourning woman's grief. The sea raged just beyond the cliffs, its fury audible even through the thick windows of Halverton Manor. Trees bowed and moaned in protest, and rain fell not in drops but in sheets, unrelenting, wild, and cold. Inside, the house seemed to shudder with every gust, its old bones creaking under the strain. Fireplaces blazed in every chamber, but the warmth did little to temper the chill that moved beneath Lucille's skin. She stood in the blue sitting room, a place rarely used, with high-arched windows and faded silk drapes, once elegant, but now sun-touched and slightly torn at the hems. The walls were papered in pale cornflower blue, the edges curling, revealing the years that had passed without care. A solitary chair sat beside a bookcase, and above it an empty frame hung crookedly, as if whatever had once occupied it had been removed in haste. Lucille had not intended to be here, but the storm had made the rest of the house feel smaller, closer, suffocating. She moved slowly, trailing her hand along the wooden banister as she walked toward the forgotten corners of the manor. There was a tension in her chest that would not leave, a restlessness that no fire or tea or embroidery could soothe. She had not seen Edward since their exchange in the study, nor had she tried to. The distance between them had grown too vast, too sharp, like standing on opposite edges of a broken bridge, staring across a chasm built of things unsaid. A gust of wind rattled the shutters. Lucille turned her attention to the far wall, where a narrow wooden panel sat slightly ajar behind an old writing desk. It caught her eye, barely visible, but not quite flush with the wall. She crossed the room, curiosity stirred by instinct more than intent. With effort, she pried the panel free. Behind it, nestled in a hollow too small for anything of true value, sat a wooden box, unadorned save for a simple brass clasp. Dust coated its surface, but the shape of it was unmistakably deliberate. She hesitated, then she opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, bound in twine, yellowed with age. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the first bundle. The ink had faded in places, but the handwriting was unmistakably Edward's, elegant, deliberate, unmistakably British. Lucille sat in the lone chair, the box resting on her lap. Rain battered the windows behind her as she began to read. My dearest Eleanor, I watched you again this morning. You did not know it. You haven't known for days. You sat by the window and stared into nothing, and I could not reach you. I stood 2 paces from your soul and could not make it turn to face me. I am not a cruel man, but I have failed you. I see it in the way you fade, in the way your voice no longer touches the air. Forgive me, or don't. I no longer deserve your grace. Lucille blinked hard, her breath caught. She turned to the next. You painted the nursery walls blue. You said it reminded you of skies over Dover. We never needed the room, you knew that. And yet you painted it anyway, as if hope itself were the brush in your hand. I could not tell you then. I cannot tell you now. But I remember the shade, Eleanor. I remember your hands stained with it. I remember the tears you would not explain. She paused, the paper trembling in her grasp. The next letter was shorter and darker. I left the door open last night, hoping you would come in. You did not. You haven't in months. I think the silence has become its own kind of prayer between us. You kneel before your sorrow, and I before my guilt. I dreamt of your voice, and awoke to waves crashing against the rocks. But you were not there, only the sea. Lucille's chest tightened. She turned the final letter over. It was the only one not folded. The ink looked fresher, as if written last. It was the night of the storm. You wore the ivory shawl, the one with the frayed edge. You said you would only be a moment, that the sea calmed you, that it was the only place you could still hear God, but he did not hear you. Or perhaps he did. And I did nothing. I watched the door close, and I let it. I let you walk into the sea. Lucille could not breathe. She stared at the page, the words swimming before her, not because of the ink, but because of the tears she would not let fall. Eleanor. She had not died of illness. She had not faded away quietly in her bed. She had stepped into the sea, by choice, by despair. And Edward had carried that knowledge in his chest like a stone, building a mausoleum of silence around himself, around Lucille, around the entire house. The room felt suddenly smaller, suffocating. Lucille rose, the box still in her hands. She returned the letters carefully, reverently, then shut the lid and pressed it to her chest. She did not cry, but something inside her shifted. Not just sorrow, fury. She was living in the shadow of a grief she had not inherited, but had been forced to wear. The rooms she walked, the silence she obeyed, the distance she accepted, were all remnants of a love that had drowned itself, and a man too shattered to admit it. And she, Lucille, had been made prisoner to that history. No more. She placed the box on the desk, straightened her spine. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside something had awakened, not to destroy, but to demand light, to demand air, to demand a place no longer borrowed from the dead. She turned and walked out of the blue room, leaving the letters behind. But not the truth. Never again the truth. The storm had passed, but it had not left the manor unchanged. A thin veil of mist still clung to the cliffs beyond the garden, and the sea, though quiet, seemed to breathe heavier, as if mourning something unseen. The air inside the house was different now too. Not lighter, not yet, but charged, like the hush between lightning and thunder. Lucille stood by the tall window of the morning room, one hand resting against the cold glass, her reflection pale and still in the grey light. The fire crackled behind her, yet she felt no warmth. It had been 3 days since she found the letters, 3 days since she had touched Edward's grief with her own hands and left it there, unspoken. She had not told him she knew, not because she feared his anger, but because she feared something deeper, that he would not deny it, that he would simply nod, and she would see in his silence the confirmation of everything, that she lived not with a man, but with a tomb. But something else had changed too, something subtle, like a note in a melody that had not been there before. She first noticed it the morning after the storm. She had risen early, unable to sleep, and had taken her tea not in the breakfast room, but in the small sunroom adjacent to the library. It was rarely used, the floor still bearing the faded pattern of an old Turkish rug and the furniture covered in linen cloths. But the windows opened onto the eastern garden, and she longed to see something green, something untouched by memory. She poured her tea and inhaled, only to be met with a scent that did not belong. Turpentine, faint but unmistakable, and something else, the deeper, sweeter smell of linseed oil. She froze. Somewhere in this house, someone was painting. She said nothing, did nothing. She sat down, sipped her tea, and listened. And though the house remained still, her ears caught the softest sound, like a whisper of bristles against canvas. It came from the west wing. That afternoon, Edward appeared at the midday meal. It was the first time in weeks. He entered without announcement, wearing a dark grey coat and a waistcoat of charcoal velvet. His cravat was tied with care, but there was a smear of ochre just beneath the cuff of his left sleeve. Lucille said nothing of it. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silver on china and the ticking of the long case clock near the hearth. But when she reached for the teapot, she felt his gaze. She did not look up immediately, but she felt it, tangible, heavy, almost trembling with meaning. When she did meet his eyes, the moment was brief, a single breath. But in that breath, she saw not coldness. She saw pain, not sharp, not cruel, but deep, old, and laced with something that looked very much like fear. It startled her, not because she had never seen him look vulnerable, but because, for the first time, it seemed he might be vulnerable to her. That evening she walked the halls alone again. The servants had retired early, the house cloaked once more in its habitual hush. But Lucille moved not in mourning nor in restlessness. She moved with purpose. She carried no candle. The moon was high and the windows generous. Light fell in silver streaks upon the wooden floors, and her footsteps made no sound upon the rugs. She walked to the west corridor, not to the locked door, but past it, to the studio. She had never seen it open, but tonight the door was ajar, just barely. Enough. She approached. Slower now, careful. Her breath slowed, her heart quickened. She did not push the door open. She simply looked. The light from the hall reached just far enough to reveal the edge of the room, shelves lined with brushes, pigments, jars of oil. A tall easel stood turned away from the door, veiled in cloth. Canvases leaned against the wall, their backs facing her. But what drew her eye was something smaller, a stool, and upon it her glove, left hand, pale cream, the stitching delicate, unmistakable. She stepped back, closed the door. She did not take the glove. She could not. That night, she sat by the fire in her chamber, the flames casting long shadows across the walls. She wore a gown of deep plum, and her hair fell loose over her shoulders. Her book lay open but unread on her lap. She thought of the letters, of Eleanor, of the sea. She thought of the smell of turpentine, of a man who had locked himself away not to forget love, but to remember it in silence. And now, he painted again, not the sea, not the dead, her. It was not pride that stirred within her, nor vanity, it was recognition, the kind that burns slow and quiet, like coals under ash, the kind that waits for the right wind to rise. She stood, crossed the room, and closed the window. The mist had begun to return, but this time it did not feel like morning. It felt like a prelude to something neither of them yet dared name. The manor had not seen such splendor in years. That evening, Halverton rose from its hush like a forgotten instrument struck back into music. Chandeliers, once dim, were polished to gleaming brilliance. Candles multiplied in every alcove, and garlands of deep green and gold wound their way up carved banisters like serpents of light. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare trees. But within those walls, laughter and music swelled like waves against time. The masquerade had arrived. It had been Lucille's idea, a suggestion born not of rebellion, but of breath. After months of silence, of footsteps muffled by propriety and loss, she had dared to give the house one night of color. One night where no name was spoken without question, and no face revealed itself too plainly. Even Edward had agreed, if not with enthusiasm, then with resignation. A mask perhaps suited him more than truth. By 8 o'clock, carriages lined the gravel path. Newport's finest stepped into the great foyer, their identities hidden behind silken veils, jeweled half-masks, feathers and whispers. The air was thick with perfume and anticipation. Lucille descended the staircase alone. She wore a gown of deep garnet silk, the color of twilight when the sky begins to bleed. The bodice was fitted with delicate embroidery along the neckline in silver thread that caught the light with each breath. Her mask was silver, shaped like a delicate moth, wings fanned wide across her eyes, trailing faint filigree down her cheeks. Her hair, swept back and pinned with garnet combs, shimmered under the flicker of the chandelier. Every gaze turned toward her. Some knew, some guessed, some dared not say, but all saw. And across the room, Edward stood watching. He wore no ostentatious disguise, only a simple black half-mask and a tailcoat of midnight wool with a dark satin cravat. He remained in the shadows, behind the column nearest the hearth, as if presence itself were already too much, but his eyes never left her. Lucille felt it, like heat against her spine. She turned once, met his gaze for less than a heartbeat, and looked away. She could not name the ache that stirred in her, only that it was deep. The orchestra played a waltz. The dancers moved as if floating, skirts swishing like waves, heels tapping lightly against the polished floors. Lucille did not join them. She stood near the tall windows, watching the moonlit garden beyond. Frost glittered on the hedges. A soft fog crept in from the cliffs, silvered by the moon. Edward never approached, but she felt his nearness as surely as she felt the silk against her skin. Later, long after the clock had struck 10, Lucille moved through the corridor that led toward the guest rooms, her breath catching beneath her mask. The revelry behind her faded to a muted hum. She needed air, or silence, or perhaps only distance. She reached the landing of the western hall. The wing was dark, unused, closed, but there beyond the archway, a warm flicker. She frowned. A candle, left unattended. She moved closer. Her slippered feet made no sound on the rug. It had been placed on a narrow side table, just below a heavy velvet curtain that hung halfway over a broken window pane. The wind from outside stirred the curtain. The flame bent toward it. And in one silent, terrifying instant, fire. The velvet caught with a suddenness that defied reason, and the flames leapt upward like a scream. Smoke poured into the corridor. Lucille turned, heart thudding, and ran. The music below continued. No one knew. No one had seen. She reached the staircase, her voice caught in her throat. Then with fury she tore the silver mask from her face and shouted, "Fire! Help!" Servants appeared at once. Cries broke out. Panic flickered like lightning through the ballroom, but Lucille did not stay. She turned and ran back up the stairs, into the smoke, toward the west wing, toward him. She reached the locked door. Her hands, gloved in satin, slipped against the handle. It did not yield. "Edward!" she cried, voice hoarse. No answer. Smoke thickened. Her lungs burned. Without thought, she seized the brass vase from the table and slammed it against the doorknob once, twice, until it broke with a snap. The door creaked open. The heat inside was unbearable. She stepped through. The studio was ablaze. One curtain had collapsed into a pile of flame. The rug smoldered, and embers danced in the air like fireflies of death. But there, near the far wall, Edward collapsed. Unmoving, Lucille ran to him. The smoke clawed at her throat. Her eyes burned. She fell to her knees, trembling, and touched his face. His skin was hot, but his chest rose and fell. He was alive. "Edward," she whispered, shaking him. "Please!" His eyelids fluttered. He coughed once, weakly. She pressed her hands to his shoulders. "We have to go. You must stand." Somehow he rose with her help, and then she saw it. Just behind him, a canvas, still smoking, a portrait of her, unfinished. The flames had licked the corner, but her face remained, pale, luminous, eyes searching. It looked not like an image, but like a memory held too long. Lucille pulled Edward toward the door. They emerged into the corridor just as two footmen appeared, buckets in hand, towels soaked in water. The wing filled with voices, shouts, and commands. Lucille said nothing. She led Edward to the far chamber and closed the door. Inside, they collapsed to the floor, breathless, coughing. For a long time, they remained like that, neither speaking. Then he turned to her. His eyes, red with smoke, clouded with emotion, found hers. "You should not have come," he rasped. She met his gaze. "I had to," she whispered. "You were burning." He closed his eyes, and this time he did not retreat, not into silence, not into the past. For the first time they remained, together, in the same flame. The morning after the fire broke over Halverton Manor in slow waves of grey. Ash drifted from the west wing like the remnants of a dream, burned too long, too hard. The sky hung low, thick with mist and morning. Seagulls circled far above the cliffs, their cries distant and shrill, echoing like unanswered questions. Inside the house, the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a museum, of rooms preserved for ghosts. It was heavier now, damp with truth. Lucille sat at the edge of the settee in the blue drawing room, her hands loosely clasped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The sleeve of her ivory robe was smudged with soot, her hair still pinned, though no longer perfect. She had slept only in fragments, dreams tangled with the heat of memory and the scent of smoke. Somewhere down the corridor, Edward was resting. The physician had insisted he remain in bed. The smoke had choked his lungs and rattled his breath, but he would recover. The physical wound was not the deepest. That much Lucille knew. The West Wing had been sealed, a portion of the studio destroyed, yet the house had not fallen, and neither had she. Not yet. She rose with deliberate grace, moving barefoot across the rug. A chill kissed the floor, but she welcomed it. Her body had burned enough the night before. Fear, heat, adrenaline. Now she needed only truth. She returned to the ruined wing before anyone else dared. The door was broken from its hinges, the corridor darkened by smoke stains. The air was thick still, but not dangerous, not anymore. She stepped inside. The studio was a ruin of contrasts. One half blackened and charred, canvas frames collapsed in a tangle near the broken easel. The other half, though smudged and scarred, remained intact. Sunlight pushing through cracked windows, dust floating like pale ghosts. She walked carefully, her fingers brushed against the singed edge of a velvet curtain, now curled and brittle. The scent of turpentine lingered still beneath the sharper tang of ash. And there, propped against the far wall, behind a fallen stool, her portrait. Or what remained of it. She approached slowly, breath caught in her chest. The top corner had burned, curling the canvas like dried leaves, but her image remained, not whole, not finished, but unmistakable. She stood, not in grandeur, not in posed artifice, but simply, a quiet strength in her face, a sorrow traced into the line of her mouth. Her hands, one slightly raised as if about to turn a page or perhaps reach. She recognized the moment. It was hers. She had stood like that weeks ago near the window in the music salon, alone, unaware. He had seen her, not as a baroness, not as a replacement, but as herself. Her eyes drifted across the room, more paintings, stacked against the wall, some wrapped in linen, others bare. She reached for one, heart thudding, pulled back the cloth. Herself again, reading by the fire. Another, walking in the eastern garden, her shawl clutched close around her. Another still, seated, hands in her lap, looking away. Not posed, not aware. She gasped softly. Dozens, all of her, each one a secret confession, each one a moment stolen by eyes too afraid to speak. She turned slowly toward the door, and there, leaning in the threshold, pale and breathless, was Edward. He wore a loose shirt, untucked, open at the throat. His face bore the strain of the night, his eyes red-rimmed, his posture weak, but he stood. Their eyes met across the room, across the wreckage. "I told them you needed rest," she said quietly. "You shouldn't be here." "I couldn't sleep," he answered. His voice was rough, low. "I had to see." She nodded, not trusting her voice. He stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, like a man walking through memory. "I didn't mean for you to see them," he said. "But you painted them," she replied, "over and over." He closed his eyes. "I had no other way." She looked around, the ruin, the reverence, her own face, everywhere. "How long?" she asked. He inhaled. "Since the first day." Silence fell, not cold, not cruel, only full. She turned toward the portrait, the unfinished one, the edges still warm with yesterday's flame. "You watched me live," she whispered. "But you did not join me." "I didn't know how," he said. "Why?" she asked, more breath than sound. He hesitated, his jaw clenched, then loosened. "I left the candle," he said, "too close to the curtain. On purpose." Her stomach turned. "You?" "I didn't strike a match," he said, "but I didn't move it. I stood there, watching it flicker. And I thought," his voice broke and he swallowed hard, "I thought perhaps it would end it all. The house, the past, me." Lucille did not move. "I didn't expect you to run into the fire," he said. "I didn't expect you to still be breathing," she said softly. "And yet here we are." He stepped closer. "I've painted every corner of you," he said, "but I've never had the courage to touch the truth of you." She turned to him then. And in that gaze, bare, unmasked, they stood with the truth between them. "I am not her," Lucille said. "I know," he answered. She walked into the sea, she said. You have lived in it ever since. He did not deny it. I came here to be a wife, Edward, she said, not a relic. I didn't know I still had breath to offer, he said. And now? She asked. He looked at her, truly looked. Not as subject, not as shadow, but as woman. I want to learn, he said, if you'll let me. Lucille took a step forward slowly. Between them the burned portrait still stood, and around them the ashes of silence drifted to the floor like snow finally released from heavy skies. She reached for his hand, and this time he did not pull away. The sea had quieted. For days now it had moved not in rage, but in slow, heavy sighs, as if mourning something that had already passed. Along the cliffs, the air was still, the frost beginning to creep back onto the glass, and Halverton Manor remained half-veiled in the pale light of an early winter morning. Inside, the hearths burned again, not with grandeur, but with necessity. Footsteps echoed more freely through the halls. The scent of smoke, though lingering faintly in the walls, no longer clung to every breath. Edward had not left his chamber, not out of weakness. The physician had declared him well enough to rise. The wounds to his lungs had been minor, but the man remained within, seated by the fire in a dressing robe of dark wool, his posture as if carved from the very stone of the manor's foundation. He ate little, spoke less. The nurses came and went like distant ghosts, and the servants had learned not to expect conversation. Lucille had not gone to him, not yet, not because of anger nor pride, but because she understood that silence too had its stages. It could be shelter, it could be defense. And sometimes it was the only language grief would allow, but grief could not have the last word. That morning, the frost had drawn delicate vines across the windows of the music salon. Lucille stood before the fireplace, her reflection a faint wisp in the glass. Her gown was of slate blue, simple and warm, and her hair had been pulled back, though a few strands had slipped free to frame her face. She had not slept well. Dreams clung to her skin like a second gown, made of memory and smoke. She turned and crossed the corridor. Her steps did not hesitate. At his door she knocked once. There was no answer. She opened it anyway. The chamber was dim, the fire low. Edward sat in the wing-back chair nearest the window, one hand resting on the armrest, the other on a closed book in his lap. He did not look up when she entered, but he did not turn her away. Lucille stepped inside, closed the door softly behind her. I expected to find you in the studio, she said quietly. His voice was rough. There's nothing left to paint. She crossed the room and stood a few paces away, watching the side of his face. You could paint something new, she offered. He shook his head, barely. I don't know what that means anymore. Silence gathered between them like dust. Lucille drew a breath. Do you blame me? He looked at her then, slowly. No, he said. You saved my life. She met his gaze. Did you want it saved? He closed his eyes. No. Lucille sat on the edge of the second chair, not quite beside him, but near enough that the heat of his breath, uneven and fragile, brushed against her. I saw them, she said. The portraits. His fingers tightened slightly around the book. I never meant for you to. But you did paint them, she said. Dozens. He nodded once. I painted you because I couldn't speak to you, because I needed to keep you somewhere. Her voice was steady, but low. Why? His answer came not quickly, but with weight. Because I thought I would lose you too, if I reached out, if I touched anything again. Lucille's eyes shimmered, but she did not look away. Why did you leave England? She asked. Edward turned back to the fire. Because they said I killed her. Lucille's breath caught. She waited. Eleanor's family, he continued. They blamed me, said I let her slip, that I fed her delusions with my distance, that I buried her in silence. And maybe they were right. I didn't know how to stop it. I tried to pull her back, but she only drifted further, until there was nothing left of the girl I married, nothing but music and shadows and prayers that led nowhere. Lucille listened, her hands still in her lap. They said I drove her to madness, he murmured, and perhaps I did. The fire crackled softly. Edward's voice was hollow now. So I left. I couldn't bear the weight of her name in every drawing room, every whisper. I came here to forget, or at least to be forgotten. Lucille let the silence settle between them like a heavy veil. Then she spoke. "You're not the only one who buried someone." He turned to her, his brow furrowed. She met his eyes without faltering. "I buried myself," she said, "after my husband died. I buried the version of me that danced, that smiled without calculation. I remember standing in a room full of people and feeling as though I had vanished, and no one noticed." Edward watched her, his expression unreadable but attentive. "I wasn't young when I married," Lucille continued, "but I was hopeful. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't warm either. And when he died, I thought I'd be free to begin again. But society doesn't welcome widows. It tolerates them, with politeness, with invitations that arrive too late, with silence in rooms that used to call your name." She paused, her throat tight. "And so I learned to be quiet, to be poised, to fold myself into a version they could accept. No passion, no foolishness, just presence." She looked at him now, her voice low and clear. "And then I came here, to this house, to you, and I saw a man hiding in the ruins of his past, asking for silence in place of love. And I accepted that because I had long forgotten how to ask for more." Edward's eyes glistened. "I didn't know," he said. "You never asked." He lowered his gaze. "I thought I didn't deserve to." Lucille rose and stepped toward him. She kneeled beside the chair, her hands resting gently over his. "You were wrong," she whispered. "We both were." His fingers curled over hers. Their eyes met, no longer strangers across a hallway, no longer enemies across a battlefield of grief, but two souls, ash-covered and bruised, finally seeing the other without the mask. He reached for her hand, truly, completely, and she let him. In the hush of that winter morning, with the fire gently crackling beside them, they sat together, not with speeches, not with grand promises, but with breath, with presence, with the kind of silence that did not divide, but healed. For the first time, they did not hold on to memory. They held onto each other. Weeks passed, and with them the winter softened its grip. The frost that once etched ghostly vines upon the windows began to retreat, and the sun, timid but steady, returned to Halverton Manor in golden slivers. The house no longer held its breath. It exhaled, slowly, gratefully, like a body awakening from long illness. The west wing remained sealed for repairs, but the scent of soot no longer clung to every hallway. Laughter did not echo through the rooms, not yet, but silence had shed its weight. It no longer pressed down with grief. It merely lingered as a companion, neither cold nor cruel. In the eastern corridors, the curtains had been drawn back, dust cloths folded. Lucille had begun to rearrange small things, vases, cushions, a framed miniature on a side table. She did not ask permission. She no longer needed to. The manor was not hers by name alone. It had become hers by breath. One morning, just before the bells of St. Jude's rang 8, a letter arrived from Boston. The handwriting was familiar, precise, floral. It was from Mrs. Evangeline Carr. Lucille read it by the fire in the music salon, her feet curled beneath her on the settee. The invitation was as gracious as it was sharp, lined with veiled inquiries and coated admiration. There would be a gathering at the Thompson estate, a musical evening. Many remembered Lucille fondly and wished to see her again. Newport, surely, had grown tedious. Lucille folded the letter, pressed it flat, set it aside. She did not respond. Later that day, the wind swept in from the sea, cool but fragrant with salt, and the faint promise of thaw. Lucille made her way down the corridor that led to the south-facing wing, the one Edward had reclaimed as a new studio. It had taken time to prepare. Windows had been replaced, new canvas stretched, a skylight had been opened where the ceiling had once sagged. The scent of paint and oil was fresh, yet clean. She entered without knocking. The room welcomed her with warmth and light. Pale blue walls, sparse furniture, the tall windows opened to the garden, and him. Edward stood before a blank canvas, brush in hand, the sleeve of his linen shirt rolled up to the elbow. He looked up when she crossed the threshold, not startled, but expectant. He set the brush aside. "I was hoping you would come," he said. Lucille smiled. She wore a gown of soft grey today, embroidered with thread the colour of dusk. Her hair was gathered at the nape, loose tendrils framing her face. No jewels, no brooch, only light. "I wanted to see what you've done," she said. He motioned to the wall, where a handful of sketches had been pinned, charcoal and soft pencil, unfinished forms, some abstract, others hinting at expression. She stepped closer. One sketch caught her eye. A woman seated, her head turned slightly, eyes not cast downward but outward, towards something unnamed. It was her, but not as she had been, not as a baroness, not as a bride, not even as the subject of a painter's obsession. It was her alive. "What do you see?" he asked softly. Lucille didn't answer right away. She stared at the sketch, then turned to him. "Myself," she said. He nodded, his voice gentler still. "I want to paint you again," he said. "But not as the Baroness, not as the woman I kept in silence. I want to paint the woman who walked through fire." Lucille's throat tightened, but her gaze did not falter. "Then I will sit," she whispered. He pulled the stool into place near the window, adjusting it until the light fell gently on her face. He did not instruct her where to look. He did not tell her how to hold her hands. He simply looked at her, and she looked back. For a long moment, he did not lift the brush. He memorized the way her breath moved beneath her collarbone, the line of her mouth when it softened, the glint of something fierce, something free, in the pale blue of her eyes. When he finally began to paint, there was no rush, no fevered strokes, only stillness, only reverence. Hours passed in quiet. A servant brought tea they barely noticed. Shadows lengthened. The fire was lit. Lucille did not ask what he saw in her. She no longer needed to. He had spoken it in silence, in pigment, in the choice to see her not as a symbol, but as a soul. That evening she dressed once more in the gown she had worn the night of the fire. The garnet silk had been cleaned, though the hem bore a faint scorch at the edge, a memory not erased but accepted. Her hair was swept up simply. She wore no mask. She stepped out into the twilight, the sky painted in lavender and gold. The sea stretched vast before her, no longer a graveyard but a mirror. The waves moved gently, as if keeping time with her breath. She stood on the cliff's edge, facing the wind, facing the sun, and behind her at a distance, Edward stood with his easel, watching, painting, not in secret, not in sorrow, but in light. And he smiled. The canvas before him was not yet complete, but neither was she, and that, finally, was the point. Halverton Manor, summer of 1898. The roses bloomed later that year. A stubborn spring had delayed them, but by June the gardens had exploded into colour. Crimson, ivory and blush petals reached toward the sun, climbing the trellises that bordered the eastern wall like memories determined to be seen. The manor had changed, and yet it had not. The west wing had been fully restored, not in grandeur, but in grace. The studio had become the heart of the home, its walls lined with portraits that captured moments rather than faces. A woman brushing windblown hair from her brow, a child chasing shadows in the garden, a pair of hands clasped beneath a tree heavy with blossoms. Edward no longer painted in solitude. He had not stopped painting Lucille, but he had stopped hiding her in canvas. Now she stood beside him, not as subject but as partner, muse and mistress of the house, mother. The child came unexpectedly 5 years after the fire, when Lucille had nearly given up hope that her body could carry life again. She was 39 when she felt the flutter in her womb, 40 when she first held their daughter in her arms. They named her Eleanor Rose, not as a tribute to the past, but as a reclamation, a healing, a name reborn in gentleness. She was a quiet child, observant, solemn-eyed, with the dark lashes of her father and the quiet strength of her mother. Now 7, she ran barefoot through the gardens, often with charcoal on her fingers and questions on her lips. Lucille stood beneath the wisteria arch that morning, a linen shawl draped around her shoulders despite the warmth. In her hands she held a letter from Boston. She had not returned in 8 years, though invitations still arrived. The latest one spoke of change. Women's clubs had grown in number. Discussions of suffrage were no longer whispered. Mrs. Carr had passed away the winter before, her legacy one of beauty, but not kindness. Society had changed, slowly, but it had. Lucille had been invited to speak, to represent a life lived outside the lines. A baroness who chose not power or title, but selfhood. She folded the letter. Perhaps she would go, not for them, but for her daughter. Inside the house, Edward read by the fire, spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. The lines near his eyes had deepened, but his hands remained steady. When Lucille entered, he looked up with the ease of a man who had learned to stop holding his breath. "There you are," he said softly. "She's asking for you. Wants to show you the sunset she painted in the East Corridor." Lucille smiled and moved toward him, pressing a kiss to his temple. "Then let's go." They walked together, hand in hand, down the corridor where so much sorrow had once lingered. The past had not vanished, but it had softened. There had been prices paid. For years Edward had carried guilt, not only for Eleanor's death, but for how long he had withheld himself from life. He had wept once in Lucille's arms, not from grief, but from the realization that he had almost let love pass him twice. Lucille had carried her own burdens. The loneliness of widowhood, the quiet anger of being forgotten, the ache of learning to forgive a man who had loved her in silence when she needed words. But time had been gentle with them, not because it owed them peace, but because they had earned it. In the Eastern Corridor, Eleanor Rose waited beside her painting. A mess of orange and violet swirled across the canvas, wild and bold. "It's not perfect," she said, looking up. Edward crouched beside her. "That's why it's beautiful." Lucille reached for her daughter's hand and held it. The sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the manor. And for the first time in years, Halverton Manor was no longer just a house rebuilt. It was a home, full of breath, full of light, and full of love that had endured, not because it was loud or grand, but because it had been chosen, again and again, even in the